Tom Anderson, a quietly powerful real estate mogul, survives a near-fatal heart attack. While hospitalized, his son Brandon forges documents, sells Tom's beach house and prized car collection, and squanders the proceeds. Tom discovers the fraud, quietly gathers medical records, recordings, video, and business proof, and exposes Brandon at his engagement party by publicly revealing the theft and that Brandon used Tom's own agency to launder sales. The scandal destroys Brandon's engagement, leads to arrest/conviction, and ultimately forces a painful reckoning and slow path to redemption. Tom rebuilds safeguards and hopes for restoration. The chest pain arrived like a freight train. Tom's coffee cup trembled in his hand, a thin brown circle still steaming on the counter. Outside the kitchen window, gulls argued over the morning tide. He'd built the house by hand, every board, every banister, every memory. Sarah had liked it that way, simple, honest work. This morning, the salt wind tasted like iron. He tried to breathe through it, thinking first of small things, don't wreck the lawn, as if a broken heart could be managed with household chores. The light behind Sarah's portrait stuttered. The world folded. That was the last thing he remembered for a long time. The next thing was the beeping, insistent, clinical of a monitor at Mount Sinai and white sheets that smelled of antiseptic and shampoo. Tubes cut across his arms like foreign vines. Somewhere, a nurse said, stabilized, as if life could be summarized in a single word. Brandon was there when Tom opened his eyes, young, immaculate, shoulders tight with rehearsed concern. "Dad," he said, voice clipped, eyes shining. Relief, pride, and something else, too quick to engineering a solution. "Don't worry. I'll handle everything." Tom believed him by instinct. You believed your child 1,000 times before you learned the difference between love and leverage. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and regret. Dr. Samuel Brooks moved through it like a man in a well-fitted worry. He gave the tests simple questions, the kind that measure memory, dates, names, the color of an apple. Tom answered, precise, even lucid in the fog of medication, 29 out of 30. That detail felt small in the moment. Later it would be everything. When he came home, the driveway offered silence. An empty garage yawned where Chrome used to sleep, absence that smelled like betrayal. The sold sign on the bluff was new, bright against the wind. Tom felt the world tip sideways and then steady with a cold, methodical focus. Nothing in him flared. Rage, yes, sharp, clinical, but it arrived with thinking attached. He had spent 40 years learning how to read ledgers, contracts, and human weakness. He had also learned how to be patient. He sat at the kitchen table, the only room where the echoes of Sarah lingered soft and intact, her handwriting on a birthday card, the coffee cup she used when she watched the news. He held her last letter, a short note written before the hospital beds, a plea for him to make their son earn his place. He had shelved that request like a small, honest relic. Now he unfolded it and felt the words like a summons. Outside, the ocean kept doing what oceans do, erasing footprints, swallowing the horizon. Inside, Tom began to inventory loss not as a man crushed, but as a man cataloging evidence, car titles, deeds, signatures. He would need witnesses, paper, time, things a heart attack had given him in abundance, a clearer sense of what mattered. He would not scream. He would not beg. He would sit and become a ledger with a pulse, and wait until the right moment to write the truth in public light. A rustle in the driveway. Brandon's BMW idled at the curb, too new, too clean. He stepped into the kitchen carrying a manila folder and a practiced apology. "Dad, I had to make tough calls." Tom watched his son's hands, steady, maybe too steady, and the first seed of an ugly understanding took root. An amateur had assumed a chessboard was a toy. Tom kept the manila folder open like a book he'd read through and through. Brandon's handwriting looped on the power of attorney pages. The signature mimicked the curl at the end of Tom's T with uncanny closeness. Tom had signed thousands of forms in his life. Deeds, permits, partnership agreements, and forgery carries a certain small arrogance, the confident stroke that thinks it can imitate a life. Insurance, Brandon began, the practiced voice of a man trained to make complexity sound like mercy. Maintenance, taxes, things were bleeding while you were in ICU. I sold depreciating assets. He said, depreciating like a word from a ledger meant to justify theft. Tom listened while the kitchen felt smaller, voices softened by a family interior that had once been wide with laughter. He let Brandon talk. Every sentence was a scaffolding of lies. When Brandon described emerging market funds with vigor, Tom watched the words like a machine learning a script, the cadence, the borrowed confidence, borrowed phrases clipped from late-night finance channels. He pressed record on his phone the way a carpenter keeps a spare tool close, because proof mattered more than accusation. Margaret Wilson arrived the next morning with banker's boxes and a look that had seen more boardroom dramas than most soap operas. She was the quiet power in a tailored suit. Her steadiness was a stone in Tom's hand. Together they opened years of dust, incorporation papers, incorporation dates, brand plaques, newspaper clippings, evidence of a life built that Tom had never flaunted. Brandon's chosen hub, the Wilson Coastal Properties sign on the field, was the delicious irony that made the plan perverse. He had brought his crime to his father's house and paid a commission into his father's pocket. To Brandon it was elegant, to Tom it was an inept cowardice. Tom smiled then, surprising himself. People who stole from strangers did so in ways that were clever and cowardly. People who stole from family habitually believed in their rightness. That combination promised spectacle. Still, Tom paused each time he felt the impulse to humiliate him. There was a private ledger in which his late wife's voice kept him honest. Justice, not vengeance. He wanted his son to understand the cost of what he'd done for tenants, for clients, for the idea that a name stands for something. Margaret compiled spreadsheets, commission amounts, timeline cross-checks. The math moved like a tide: $2.3 million for the house, $890,000 in classic cars. A lifetime stripped in a few transactions glued with forged ink. Brandon had left digital traces, and Tom began to hunt them. A junior associate at the agency, Rebecca, had signed off in bad faith. A time-stamped video caught Brandon at a conference table signing. Elena Rodriguez, the private investigator Margaret hired, sent receipts and photographs as if they were a slow flicker of the inevitable. Each image, each transfer, pulled threads tighter. Tom found something worse than greed in his son's purchases: legitimation. Brandon had been selling a story of being gifted an inheritance, to win favor, to stand taller in rooms that measured success with nickeled watches and dances at marinas. He'd used other people's goodwill as cover. He had used Catherine's engagement to manufacture status. Tom's plan settled into a shape: exposure in a room full of witnesses. Not shouting, not a smear, truth presented surgically. The engagement party was perfect theater. 200 people, 2 families, and every liar's ego all dressed in formal wear. He would present evidence, yes, but more importantly, he would remove the fog, the lies about inheritance, the fictions that let people collude with theft. There were nights he sat awake replaying the kitchen fight, feeling the moral weight of what he planned. He would call the police. He would press charges. He wrote and rewrote the speech he would not give. He had no desire for revenge's pyrotechnics. He wanted clarity, consequence, and for his son to face the simple truth that some bridges cannot be repaired with money alone. Brandon seemed to be spiraling. Tom watched his son more than he watched the accounts now. The way Brandon laughed a fraction too loud at work. The way he tried to charm investors who smelled only desperation, not genius. Tom felt a strange tenderness, an ache for the boy who once learned to tie shoelaces at his kitchen table. That tenderness complicated his resolve, but did not break it. The world, he thought, will learn what we teach our children: honor or entitlement. The engagement invitation lay on the table like a dare. "Please, Dad, say a few words," Brandon had written with an embarrassed flourish. In a different life, that flourish would have been proof of affection. In this life, it was a loaded line: public praise, a coronation built upon theft. Tom rehearsed the reveal in small rooms first: Margaret's office, the detective's interrogation room, the quiet of his dining room while the ocean beat a patient rhythm outside. Each rehearsal tightened the plan. If he exposed the recording alone, it would be a humiliation. If he produced only the forged signatures, it might be dismissed as family quarrel. He needed a narrative that would not bend away from the truth. Medical records proving incapacity did not exist. Dr. Brooks' tests proved lucidity. Security footage showed Brandon performing the fraud. Elena's receipts traced the money through a trail of jewelry, hotel rooms, and leases. 3 days before the party, he received a call that cracked his focus. It was a private investigator, not Elena, breathing hard with news that made Tom's throat close. "There's more," she said. "Your son passed a payment to someone connected with a shell company. And cans of records show someone else accessed the files." The twist tightened into a new coil. Brandon was not acting alone. Someone had facilitated introductions, provided accounts, perhaps laundered funds in a way that cut deeper than a reckless son's greed. The scope was wider than personal betrayal. It flirted with organized deception. Tom felt the room tilt. This was no longer simply about family shame. If others were involved, bankers or partners, justice would require a different, harder path. He could expose Brandon tonight and risk the other elements slipping away into the wash, armchair commentators calling it domestic drama. Or he could widen the circle of evidence, coordinate with Detective Martinez and Elena, and ensure the net closed on every hand that picked up his money. He chose the net. The decision changed his timeline. The party would still be the stage, but the exposition would be surgical, reveal Brandon's confession, the forged documents, then systematically lay out the chain that led from his living room to nightclubs and a shell account with no names. A small breath of strategy. Make it airtight. Make it undeniable. Bring Dr. Brooks into the light. Bring Rebecca's email logs. Make the room feel not like a courtroom but like a jury, because in a small coastal town, reputation is a public currency. In the compressed days that followed, Tom felt something old resurrecting under his ribs. It was not vengeance so much as an engineer's stubborn insistence that structures be true. He began to think of the people beyond his son, the tenants who would lose the consistency of rent checks if his portfolio collapsed, the employees at Wilson Coastal who had nothing to do with this theft, the Mills family who had been used as social proof. Exposure now had to serve more than catharsis. It had to deliver protection. There was a moment 2 nights before the event that threatened to fracture him. He found Brandon at midnight in the town's marina, standing under sodium lamps, talking on a phone with hands that trembled. "I can still fix it," Brandon murmured, as if constructing a future out of apologies could mend wire and nail. Tom watched him from the shadow of his car and felt something split. The boy he loved and the man who had taken his life savings were both visible in the same figure. For a second, the urge to step forward to comfort or to strike roared inside him. He stayed in the car and watched as Brandon hung up and left, carrying a duffel that seemed too heavy for a man carrying only shame. The sight hardened Tom's resolve. Mercy, he thought, would be rooted in accountability. This was not cruelty. It was the difficult business of teaching a man to rebuild honestly. At the engagement rehearsal 2 days later, Brandon practiced a toast about partnership and stewardship, language Tom had used when he taught his son to read blueprints. The room smelled of flowers and candles and a fragile optimism. Tom felt his pulse steady. When he opened his blazer to take the manila envelope and stepped toward the microphone, he carried not just evidence but a choice, to speak with the slow heat of truth and let the public decide what kind of son Brandon would be remembered as. The ballroom waited in that hesitant hush that precedes a storm. Crystal chandeliers trembled like breath under silk. Servers slid between tables with the efficient ballet of people whose job is to make everything appear effortless. Tom stood at the edge of it all, his suit buttoned, the manila envelope warm under his palm. People clustered in pockets of conversation, the mills of small talk grinding, unaware of the blade poised to cut. Brandon found him first, a practiced smile pasted on, Catherine at his arm like a shield. Her eyes were bright with real belief. She'd never had cause to doubt him yet. Tom saw it and felt the human cost in the way it made him breathe. He could have called Catherine aside privately. But the decision had been made. Honesty is a public act here. If a lie had been the currency, then truth had to be the public official who confiscated it. "Dad," Brandon whispered, earnest in the way self-justifying people often are. "This means everything." That sentence could have been gratitude or a plea. Tom said nothing. He thought of Sarah's note, Margaret's spreadsheets, the recorded conversations. He thought of tenants who trusted rent would come like clockwork, of employees who showed up to work because someone's paycheck depended on stewardship. He thought of the kid who once learned to tie his shoes at a small kitchen table. When the sudden hush came, someone clinked a glass and people turned. Tom stepped forward. Microphones were offered. He did not take them like a man hungry for spectacle. He took them like a surgeon beginning a necessary incision. "I'd like to say a few words," he said, and the room leaned in. First, he pressed play. Brandon's voice filled the space, smooth, arrogant, explaining the liquidation as education. People shifted. The recording was worse than confession. It was performance, how he had convinced himself and his audience this was stewardship, not theft. Brandon's face lost color. He reached for the phone, a reflex. Tom let him fumble. Then Tom laid out the timeline, the hospital dates, Dr. Brooks' tests, my lucid answers, the absence of a signature on January 22nd, because Tom had been unconscious, facts with the cold clarity of court exhibits. He produced the forged power of attorney, the timestamps on the security footage. The video rolled on the ballroom screen. Brandon, inside Wilson Coastal Properties, pen moving as if the signature could stand in for truth. Guests watched someone they'd applauded in other contexts committing an act that felt like sacrilege. A ripple moved through the room, from confusion to denial to horror. Catherine's hand clamped around her ring, her face anesthetized with disbelief. Some guests had been investors, some were neighbors, a few were clients who recognized the company name and stared at Tom with new awe. The Mills family clustered together, their social map being redrawn in real time. Brandon tried to speak, a raw sound that was not yet a coherent sentence. "It was for your bills," he started, an old trope of justification. Tom shook his head. "You forged my name," he said. "You sold my home. You sold the cars I restored. You lied to people who trusted you. And you used my company to do it." The room felt like an amphitheater of judgment. Richard Mills stepped forward, indignation and concern warred across his face. "Tom, surely there's an explanation," he said, the public father trying to preserve a daughter's future. Tom nodded to Margaret and Elena. Documents and receipts glowed in the projector's light. Elena's slideshow cataloged luxury purchases, an engagement ring, a Rolex, a trail of nights that read like evidence of splurging rather than stewardship. The hush broke into murmurs that swelled into accusations and camera phones. Someone shouted, "Call the cops." Brandon's face shifted from pale to flailed, the final feasible mask gone. He was a man exposed, not only for stealing money, but for deceiving the social capital that stood as his ladder. Tom could feel the complex surge, pity for the young man he'd raised, sorrow for the daughter whose ring now sat like a hot thing on her finger, fury for tenants and clients who might be collateral damage. But he had done the hard work, the medical testimony, the video, the recordings. He had chosen a public airing because the lies had been public. When Detective Martinez appeared shortly after, arranged in quiet minutes with a friend in the force, the transition from theater to justice was almost seamless. Someone from the crowd dialed. Cameras hummed. Brandon fled the room like a man with no home. The engagement crumbled in a few sharp breaths. Tom left with the quiet that follows a storm. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't raised a fist. He'd showed the ledger, and the ledger spoke. Outside, the ocean was indifferent, but within him something gave, a strange blend of relief and grief. The pieces were in motion now. The hardest part remained, the knowledge that love could coexist with consequence. They read the charges in the precinct with a formality Tom found almost respectful, words that transformed his private ledger into public law, elder fraud, forgery, theft over $50,000. The detective slid the files across the table with hands that matched her voice, steady, seasoned, final. Brandon's booking photo later would look like a mugshot of a life suddenly compressed into one frame. Sitting across from the officer, Tom felt oddly removed, as if he were watching a slow film of his own life and only now recognizing the director's hand. He had intended the reveal, organized the proofs, and set the stage. The arrest felt like the inevitable denouement of a story he'd scripted for the sake of something bigger, to guard tenants' checks, employees' livelihoods, and the sanctity of contract. He had also done it to wake his son. When Brandon called from the holding cell, the voice that came through the line was raw, thin with the flat panic of a man learning legal vocabulary too late. "Dad, please," he begged, the plea of someone accustomed to bargaining as a way of life. Tom listened to the plea the way a man listens to a child on a boat who is asking for a lifeline. He answered with the care a father still carries even when the child is broken. "Get a lawyer," he said. "Tell the truth. Make restitution." The trial moved like seasons, documents produced, testimony measured, the public peering through headlines into a family once private. Dr. Brooks testified to the clinical tests, 29 and 30 out of 30 on dates and, most damningly, lucidity during the hospital stay. Elena testified with receipts mapped like constellations of spend. Margaret walked the judge through incorporation papers and staff memos. The junior associate Rebecca faced cross-examination about her role. Embarrassment and responsibility weighed on her like a public tide. Brandon's defense attempted to humanize him, a young man under stress who made bad choices. But the ledger had teeth: videotaped forgery, time-stamped bank transfers, conspicuous spending on a lifestyle that could not be explained by salary. The jury sat like judges in slow opera, tallying each chord with solemn faces. When the sentence came, 4 years with the possibility of parole after 2, restitution demanded, it landed like a bell with a long echo. The room seemed to pull in its breath. Brandon's eyes met Tom's across the courtroom. For a moment, all pretense fell away, and the face that looked back was not the swaggering son who justified himself with finance jargon, but a hollowed man experiencing the full aesthetic of consequence. Walking him out in cuffs, Brandon managed a single line, small and cracking. "Dad, do you hate me?" It was a child's question in the mouth of a man. The courtroom watched for Tom's answer, eager for melodrama. Tom felt the weight of a father's voice shape truth and mercy into something that might withstand time. "No," Tom said. "I love you. But love doesn't excuse what you did." The words were not a rebuke so much as a syllabus of responsibility. The judge had balanced punishment with the hope of reform. For Tom, the sentence represented a painful fidelity to principles, upholding the law, protecting community, and refusing to let harm be normalized in private. In the weeks after, the public narrative shifted. Newsrooms wrote about elder fraud. Neighbors argued over lines between accountability and cruelty. Margaret handled interviews with a poise that felt like armor. Offers came, speakers, documentaries, but Tom refused the theater of celebrity. He had wanted justice, not applause. Brandon sent letters from prison that read like a man trying to unlearn a lifetime of excuses. He joined programs for financial literacy and anger management, nuts and bolts work that felt embarrassingly small compared to his ambitions. He asked for permission to make restitution by helping other victims once out. Tom approved, cautiously, a penance that might one day show a change in shape. For Tom, the aftermath was quieter, the model of the business unbroken, the tenants' rent checks arriving, Margaret negotiating reparations. The real work began in the private rooms, restructuring the will, setting up trustees, protective checks to guard against future breaches. He did not celebrate the conviction. He mourned the son and honored the life betrayed. He had done what he'd promised Sarah he would do, make his son earn his place. Months bled into seasons. The ocean's horizon stayed constant while small things rearranged themselves, new locks, revised trust documents, the slow return of ordinary mornings. In the kitchen where the story had begun, Tom made coffee with a hand steadier than it had been months earlier, steadiness born not of stoicism, but of the long work of repairing the architecture of a life. The town's whispers softened into something like respect. Wilson Coastal Properties, once private strength, was now a named presence. People came to Tom asking advice about tenant rights, about how to document trust. He accepted the calls not for vanity, but because the same quiet power that had kept him safe for decades could protect others. Margaret arranged community workshops. Detective Martinez lent her credibility to elder fraud awareness nights. The town, in its small, practical way, stitched itself. Brandon's letters arrived as slow, pained progress notes. He wrote about a library job teaching basic budgeting to other inmates, about the small dignity of honest work. He explained how pride and panic had combined in him into a strategy of self-delusion, how building a persona had been easier than building character. He asked, half regret, half hope, whether he might come home and begin again not as an heir, but as a man who understands that honor is daily labor. Tom read them at the kitchen table with a pen and a steady, humbling ache. He wrote back not with absolution but with scaffolding, contingency for accountability, a phased trust with milestones, requirements of honest employment, community service, and years of demonstrated responsibility. He wanted redemption to be real, earned, not purchased. On an ordinary evening, months after the sentence, Tom drove to the docks. The sky put on that coastal theater of pink and gray. He thought of Sarah, the way she taught him to measure success with kindness, and felt her there in the slow turning of the tide. He felt also the full weight of what he had done, a father's choice that cost his son his freedom and maybe saved the next vulnerable elder from exploitation. He did not pretend it had been an easy calculus. There were nights when he sat and asked if he could have done it another way, a less painful way. He had no clear answers, only the ledger of consequences and a sense that some principles were non-negotiable. He had chosen justice over private mercy and trusted that a life could be rebuilt on that foundation. When Brandon came home years later, a smaller man, deliberate in steps, Tom met him at the same kitchen table where the confession had been recorded. There was no grand reunion, no cinematic forgiveness on cue. There was instead a slow beginning: coffee, newspapers, a job at a nonprofit that advised seniors, and the daily work of trust rebuilt one honest day at a time. They worked together sometimes, Brandon in community outreach, Tom mentoring programs about estate protection. Theirs was not restoration as restoration is imagined in novels. It was the incremental, unglamorous craft of two people relearning how to be family without shortcuts. Tom watched his son teach an elderly neighbor how to read bank statements and felt an odd gratitude. Redemption was being paid forward. Years later, standing on the bluff where his beach house had once stood, Tom allowed himself a private, small smile. The ocean made its patient claims on the sand. He carried Sarah's letter in his pocket, a map of the values they had tried to keep. He had followed that map, even when the route was brutal. Honor, he told the wind out loud. Integrity. The words were like ballast. He felt them settle. If someone asked him for a lesson, he would say this: love is not the absence of consequence. It is the courage to hold someone accountable while keeping a door open, narrow, honest, and only for those willing to walk through it properly. The town kept its own memory of the story: the engagement party that became a reckoning, the bank that terminated an employee, the press columns that named a new sheriff for elder rights. Tom returned to quiet work, deeds, tenants, calls, answering the practical business of life. He had proved, in public and painful ways, that the quiet power he'd cultivated could protect a community. At dusk, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a letter that began, simply, "Dad, I am trying." He folded it with hands that had learned how to hold both grief and hope. Outside, the sea smoothed its surface as if nothing had happened at all. Inside, the world was different, scarred, yes, but steadier for the honesty that had been demanded and given. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt the future was not only salvageable, it might one day be whole.